Welcome to my Serverpod clean architecture tutorial. This is going to be a pretty awesome series where we dig into a lot of great things in Serverpod, but also just Flutter, clean architecture, solid principles in general. So I definitely still recommend watching this video, even if you don't necessarily want to use Serverpod, because although we are using that for a backend, pretty much anything that we're going to be spending time on this tutorial, in theory, will work with something like Supabase or your own custom backend, Firebase, or even really something that doesn't have a backend. But I'm using Serverpod as an example because I think it's a great project, and I haven't really found any great tutorials yet, I think, that cover proper, solid, and clean architecture when it comes to Serverpod. And I spent a bunch of time sort of trying to figure out the best way to do it, and I think I have a good way. Okay, so what we're going to be building is essentially an app that lets you sort of like see movies. Essentially, we're going to be dealing with the CRUD here, so the create, read, update, and delete, as well as authentication. So you'll see we do have a login screen, we have a sign up screen, and once you're in it, we have a list of our movies. In this example right now, I just have one, as well as a detail view, and we're going to be adding the ability to actually like create them and all that kind of stuff. So we're using, again, Serverpod on the back end. On the front end, we're going to be using FP Dart for functional programming, and we're going to be using bloc for state management, which is a project I haven't covered too much. I think I have one other series on bloc, but I've learned a lot about it. And although, if you've watched my videos before, you see I use Serverpod a lot, I figured let's kind of change it a bit up and do something with bloc, as it is, arguably the most popular state management library to this day. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, to get started, we first need to install Serverpod if you don't have it. So we're going to copy this right here, Dart pub global activate Serverpod CLI, just run it in our terminal. Then to make sure it is installed, we'll just run Serverpod, and this will give us a little message saying, okay, yep, it found it. In the case you don't find it, you might have to add your pub cache to your path, in which case you will see an error when you run this, and it will tell you what to do. Okay, so we have it installed. The next thing we want to do is actually create a project. So we can do it by doing Serverpod create. So let's just do that. Serverpod create. And I'm just going to call this movie app. You can call it whatever you want. And similar to other tutorials I've done, if movies aren't something that interests you, you could follow along this with video games. You could follow along with board games, really anything that has, sort of like a master detail sort of CRUD thing. I'm just using movies as an example because I don't think I've done that before. I've, done things with video games, music, all that kind of stuff. So we're doing movies just to kind of shake it up. Okay, so now we're just going to want to open up our movie app folder, and we're going to open it up in VS Code. And we'll just make this big for our viewers at home. Okay, so you'll see a Serverpod project actually is 3 different folders. It's kind of like what would be called like a mono repo, where we actually have our Flutter app and our server-side code all in one repo. You, of course, could decide to break these into different repos. You don't have to version control the whole thing together, but I do recommend doing it together because the front end and the back end of Serverpod, are really a cohesive thing. And if you had your Serverpod, your server code, in a different state than your Flutter code, there's going to be weird things going on. So the Flutter code, this is just a very basic Flutter app. It's essentially like the starting app that you would get when you do Flutter create, just, working with the client that your backend will have. The server-side code is a different, essentially a different project, and it's just Dart code. There's no Flutter here, but it has, your server.dart, and it has different things like endpoints and stuff we'll be getting into, your models, all that kind of good stuff. Then you have the client, and frankly, this is mostly all just going to be generated code. As you make changes in your backend, you'll be running a generate command, and it will actually be creating, these sort of files for us and updating them. You'll see it's really just like generated code. It's ugly. You're never going to want to touch anything here. It even says do not modify, all that kind of stuff. The only exception is when we're adding external modules, we may have to go into our client folder to the pub spec specifically and actually add them and change things here. Other than that, we don't really touch this. The client is kind of like the glue that connects these two things together. Okay, so we're up in, we have our project started. So let's actually get this up and running. So you need to have Docker for this. So I'm just going to load up Docker. You can download this, it's free. We'll just let that load. And we're going to also open up our terminal. Okay, so I have Docker here, and it's just some stuff from some other projects. But in order to get Docker running for this project, we are going to essentially go into the root folder. So right now, if I actually look here, I'm in the directory that looks just like this, and we're actually going to go in one folder. So we're going to go into the server, and we're going to run docker compose up, and that's going to essentially create our container. We're also going to add the build flag, and we're going to add the detach flag. And the reason for the detach flag is we want it to keep running even when this finishes. If we don't have that, we'd have to always have the terminal session running, and I don't have a need for that, so we'll detach it after. There we go. And it's because, I think this is because I'm already running something. Let me just I have another project running here. So let's just try that again. I just got a port conflict because I had something running on the Postgres port. So what really happened here? Well, if we look at the Docker Compose, it's got a couple different things in it. It's got two services. It's got a Postgres service, which is just our database, and it's mapping port 8090 to the containers port of 5432, which is just the default Postgres port. We're also passing in the name of the user, the database, and this password. Now, this was generated sort of automatically, and it's really just for development purposes. So you don't have to worry about it being too secure. When you're getting this up on a live server, that's a totally different sort of flow. You're not going to be using Docker Compose for that. And then we're also launching Redis, which likely for this, Redis is required by Serverpod. We won't be, touching it hands-on, being like, okay, do something with Redis necessarily, but it's used for things like cache, saving sessions, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of like a non-persistent database that's really fast, and this container, has it. So if we actually look at Docker now, and we should see one, and it will use the name of the folder you're in. That is, you can override that when you start it if you needed to, but this works for me. Movie app server, cool. And if we actually look in it, we'll actually see Postgres and Redis is running. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is let's just try and run the server. So we can actually go dart, and then we want to sort of go into the bin directory. So dart bin / main.dart. And we'll see if this starts up. We do get this little warning message here, which is interesting. I'm not sure. I think this is just something with the latest version of Serverpod that there's a null safety sort of thing. This isn't really an issue. I'm sure it'll get patched at some point, but I've noticed that as well. So don't freak out if you see this. However, I am seeing these errors that we have to go and figure out. So it's saying the database does not match the target database. So what's really cool about Serverpod, especially in a more recent version, is they do have what's called migrations. So you don't have to actually run SQL yourself to sort of set up the tables, which is a bit of an annoying process. And when you make changes, you don't have to worry about managing that. Migrations are awesome. Projects like Django, Ruby on Rails, they've had migrations for a long time, and Serverpod has them now, and it's probably the biggest change, in my opinion, in terms of workflow since I've been using Serverpod. So the way migrations kind of work is if we actually look in here, we'll see a migrations folder, and there's already one here. And this is actually like the initial migration that ships when we do the create, the Serverpod create command. And you'll see there's actually like some SQL that's generated of what has to happen. There's some definitions and stuff. There's metadata about the migration. Again, we don't have to worry too much about this. Serverpod's got us basically figured out. But all we have to do is essentially start. When we run the start, we have to do apply migrations. I believe it's like that. So you'll see it actually applied the migration. There we go. And then, we're having a socket error again here. Let me figure that one out. Yeah, I just had something using that port already. Basically, my reference project that I've already built that I was showing you just at the start of this video was still running, so we had a conflict. But by running that, we actually saw that the migrations were run, this one specifically, and then we got these error messages because I was running something, but if we do it again, we actually see everything's good. So you see, I can technically keep running apply migrations every time, and it's not going to do anything because the database itself is actually storing metadata about what the latest migration is. So I can safely run it. It's not going to do anything if there isn't anything new. But at this point, I can also just as easily start it with just running main.dart, which we will do. Okay, so let's take a look at the data here. Now I am using a program called Data Grip, and you can use really any SQL client. This is my favorite one. The only downside of it is a paid application, but there's VS Code extensions for this. There's something, there's a lot of Postgres sort of things. But let's actually take a look at what's going on here. So I'm going to add Postgres here, and we're just going to give it a name. We'll call it movie app, and it's localhost. The port is different. If we actually go to our Docker Compose, we'll see that it's 8090 is what we want to use here. So we'll put that. The user is Postgres, so that's fine. Password, I'm just going to grab the password and put it here, and the database itself is just called movie app. So we'll just do all those things, and we'll click the test connection to make sure it works. Yep, succeeded. We'll click OK. And if we actually open up movie app public, we'll actually see the different tables that exist. So we have things like that are built into Serverpod, like auth key, cloud storage, session logs, health metrics, all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, we're going to be creating our own models and our own tables and stuff like that too. So that's kind of, like the structure of how this sort of works. And we're up and running and we're good to go. So what I'd like to start with is creating our primary model for this application, which is the movie. And the way models work in Serverpod is rather neat. It's more of a configuration than writing code. So we're actually going to go into our lib folder within Server, into source, into models, and we're going to create a new file, and we're just going to call it movie.yaml. Okay, now in here we need to give it a name. So we give it a class name called movie. That's great. We also want to give it a table, and this is the database table that will be used. If your model that you're making doesn't actually need to be stored in a database, you can omit this line and still work with it in the same way. It's just not something that's going to be persistent. And there's definitely use cases for that, but for our purposes now, we will be using a database. Then we have to define the fields. So we just go simply this, fields, indent, and then let's have a title, and we have to say it's of type string. So we're kind of using the Dart, naming conventions of different data types. I also want to store a year, kind of like the release year, I guess. And let's store an image URL of a string. And let's also store like a, I guess a log line is what it would be called, kind of like the short 1 or 2 sentences about it. So we'll save that. I'm going to stop my server, and we're going to run a command to essentially generate this code. So what we'll do is serverpod generate, and we'll see it's generating code. And what's cool now, if we go into the generated folder, we're actually going to see movie.dart. So it made this whole Dart file for us. A lot of boilerplate stuff, a lot of stuff for to.json, from JSON, it's column stuff that, this is a pretty big file, right? Literally by us just defining this, it's generated this for us. So that's half the battle. We have that generated. We also have in the movie app client, there's going to be sort of like the bridge connecting the 2 dots between the front end and the back end for movie. But the other part that we're missing is the database change. By just running generate, we did not actually, change our database. If I go back to data grip and, even let's see, refresh this, I'm not going to see a new database table called movies yet. But in order to do that, we're going to run and apply our migrations. So the first thing we do is actually generate the migrations. So to do that, we do serverpod create-migration. And we'll see, okay, it created this new migration. And let's just take a look at what that looks like. So I believe it'll be this one here. And if we actually go to, migration.json, we can say, okay, the migration itself, it's doing a create table, giving it a name, and it's saying like what fields are in it and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just showing you this. This isn't something you necessarily have to like completely understand and ever make changes here. You shouldn't be making changes here. These are like generated files, but it is that's essentially what it's doing. It's defining like pragmatically like what this table looks like. And the idea is if we ever added something, like say we added a new field here or removed something, and let me think if there's something we need. Let's have a director name, let's call it. We'll do string. And now if we run create migration again, oh, right, we're partway through something. So I can't do this at this moment because the table actually doesn't exist. So I'll come back to this topic in a moment. But we've generated this. Let's actually apply the migration. And we've already done that. It's just running main.dart with apply migration. So I'm going to do that. And we'll actually see it's running that migration. And if I actually go back and, oops, wrong window. And if we refresh this now, we're actually going to see a movie table, right? And if we double click on it, we'll see the structure of it where it has an ID, a title, a year, image URL, and log line. Okay, so, maybe we've been working on this app for a bit. We're like, yeah, we need something like director name. So that's when we can actually go and run create migration again. And let's just do force here. And let's go and run our apply migration. And we'll refresh our movie table. And we should see, if I double click on it, we should see there's a new field called director name. There we go. So yeah, now we have like, sort of our database table and everything is good. Lastly, for now on the server side, we're going to need to make an endpoint so that our app can essentially go, hey, give me the list of movies. And we're eventually going to need other endpoints, but I want to keep this simple at first and just get things underway. So let's go to generated, let's go to endpoints within source. And you'll see there's something called an example endpoint. And this is essentially what the example app is using. It's an endpoint you can hit that you pass in a name, and it will return back to the client, hello with that name appended. So a very basic thing. I'm going to copy this. And we're just going to make a new file called movie endpoint.dart. And we're just going to rename this to movie endpoint, which extends endpoint, which is built into Serverpod. So there's a whole bunch of fun stuff here if you really want to dig deep into what you can do. But essentially, we want to create an endpoint. I'm going to call this list. So this will be an endpoint for listing the movies. And it's not going to take any parameters. We do need the session parameter. This is kind of like required in every endpoint because this is you kind of think of this as like the build context of the server side. This gives, Serverpod the access to the database and the cache and logging and all that kind of stuff. So we want to keep that, but we don't need any additional parameters. And here, what we're going to do, we're not going to return a string. We're going to return a list of, look at this, movie. So it's cool. We actually can, that model that we just made with a YAML file is, again, just like Dart code, and we can return it as a list. Now, in order to actually get all the movies, what we want to do is movie, and we want to do a static method on it. So we're not actually doing movie with the parentheses, just movie. We're going to statically access its DB, which is called like movie repository. And then we want to just do find. And we got to pass in session, like I said. So the database requires like the session you pass in to kind of like connect everything together. But this will find all movies, and you'll see it's now conforming to this. We're not getting errors. Now in the find, we could also do things where if we actually look at the find thing right here, there's things you can pass in, such as like where clauses and limits and offsets and ordering and stuff like that. So I could go, where, and do some stuff, some logic here, which we will get into at some point, but I really just want to show them all at this point. Okay, so now that we've made a change to an endpoint, and anytime we make changes to endpoints, like basically anytime we make server-side code changes, we need to regenerate. So we're just going to go serverpod generate. We won't have to do a database migration here because we haven't made any changes to our data model since the last time we've done it. But this will generate the code. And if we actually look in generated now, we'll actually see endpoints. And we'll see that if we look somewhere in here, if we look for the word movie, we'll eventually see it. Yeah, here's an endpoint connector. Again, don't have to touch this. It's generated code. I just wanted to show what it's doing. And if we look at the client code here in the library source, we're actually going to see movie.dart. And this is actually the sort of like the glue of dealing with the movie endpoint that we just made. So similarly, don't have to really, you can look at this if you're interested, see how it all works. Everything's cool, and whatnot. But yeah, the client side code or the client code, we don't really ever touch other than some configuration there. Okay, so that is essentially, a way to list these things. Now, very quickly, just so that we can kind of see how this works, although this isn't the way we're going to be building it, because we're going to be using block and everything, I just want to kind of show how can we, in a bare bones Serverpod project, actually talk to this. So we'll keep the example app, more or less. I'm going to get rid of the home page, though. And actually, no, we'll keep the home page, but I'm going to get rid of a bunch of the stuff that we're not actually going to be doing here. Let's just have a scaffold. I'll get rid of basically this, and for now, let's just put some text, and I'll just do maybe not const. Let's just do text test, and what we want to do here is, again, get rid of some things, but we're going to do it on an init state, and we're actually going to grab this client, which right now is just a global variable. We'll be doing this in a slightly better way when we get into it, but we can go client, and we can actually look at movie, so it auto-generated this for us, and then we can go .list, okay? So I can actually go something like final movies equals. Now I would have to await this, which in an init state is not really an option. So we're actually going to just make a new thing right here, init async, and that way we can actually await, and we'll call this init function here just after. And let's just go and print movies. And I'm going to save this, and I am going to just start this up on my iPhone simulator. All right, so we booted up here. Make sure, of course, that you are running your server. So the command you want to run is dart bin/main.dart. Otherwise, when this tries to connect, you're going to get an error on the Flutter side. Essentially like can't find the server. So we're running that, and we see test, which was just some text we had. But you'll see right here I have this print statement, and it is just some empty braces here because we don't have any data in our database, but it did seem to work because we're not getting an error or anything like that. So again, in order to just sort of test this out and make sure we're good, let us create a very simple way to make a movie. Again, just for testing purposes. So I'm going to make a floating action button, and we'll make its child just a icon, icons.plus. .add. And for the onPressed event, we will do something there. Set a const and save this. So here we can use that same client, and we can actually go client.movie. And here we might want to, have a way to create it. But how would we do that? So there's no create out of the box, but we can make one really easily. So we're going to go back to our server-side code, and we're going to go to our lib source endpoints, and let us go to our movie endpoint, and let's make a future that's going to return a movie, and we'll just call this let's just call this create for now. Session. This will be asynchronous, and here we're going to go await, and we want to do movie.db.insert, and in this case we want to insert insert. That would allow us to insert multiple things, but we insert row just to insert one. And we're going to insert something called movie. Now, what we can do is allow a parameter of movie to be passed up here on our client side, and this will go and save it. Now, if I go like this, we'll see what this is. This is actually going to be a reference to a movie. So it's essentially going to be the same movie that's passed in. The difference is this will actually have an ID on it. You'll notice if we look at our movie model, there's an int ID that's actually optional. And that's because when it hasn't been saved to the database, it's not going to have an ID yet. But we do want to return the ID version to our client because it's a lot of the time important for the Flutter app to know, okay, I made this new thing, but what's the ID of it, so that I can maybe do an operation on it. And for our cases, we can actually just return this to conform to that. So yeah, we have our create, and let's just go and we have to stop our server, and we need to run generate again. We don't have to do any database migrations. We didn't actually change our data. We just added a new endpoint. So let's just run this. And if we go back to our Flutter code now and go to where we are doing this, we actually see create exists. However, it's needs us to pass in a movie. So let's just make a movie real quick. I'll just do it on a different line, movie. And here we can just pass in some stuff. So maybe we'll do Jurassic Park. I believe it was 1993. Oops, 1993. I'm just going to make the image URL blank for now because I don't feel like finding that. Dinosaurs happen. That's the log line. And this is Steven Spielberg. Hopefully I can spell his name right. Maybe. And we'll basically pass that in. And let's actually go final movie equals await just so we can kind of see what this actually ends up being. And we'll just print movie. Let's actually print M and movie just so we can kind of see the difference. So M, I'll print before this, and then we'll print movie. Okay, so we'll save that. And we'll go back here and let's click the plus button. And we should see over here we have the first print. There's no ID, it's just the data we put in. But the second print, after it actually went to the server, we actually have an ID on it, which is kind of cool. Now you'll notice this list, although the print here, didn't happen or anything, so we don't have any state management, we don't really have anything really happening. But in theory now, if we actually reload our app, we should see, look, there's the data coming back from our database. So we're getting it, it's working. So just as a quick review, we can get data by going client dot the name of our endpoint dot the actual function of the endpoint and get that data back. This will be a list of movies. And we can create, in this case, by client.movie, hitting this endpoint, passing in the thing we want to create, and then, getting it back with an ID in this case. So that's our very basic, we have create happening, we have read happening because we're reading it. We don't have anything for update and delete if we're talking about CRUD, but that will come at some point. But all that being said, this is not the way we want to do this. We don't, even if we were listing out the movies, we would have to do some funky stuff to be like, okay, I just created one. Now I have to refresh the app to see it. Like that's where things like bloc are going to come into play. And that's what we're going to be, focusing the next couple lessons on, is actually setting up our proper block pattern, as well as our singletons and like dependencies, and doing things with solid and clean architecture. So yeah, I hope this quick intro kind of got some ideas going and kind of see the power of Serverpod. And to me, the real power is the fact that it kind of feels like you're working a one code base. Like I didn't go and like load up a different, editor and make some changes and whatever. It all kind of just worked. And I didn't really have to build, a traditional API where I have to worry about serializing data to, from the server to the client and then serializing it back. I'm really just working with Dart models that are the same on both sides. So that's, to me, the real power. There's a lot of other great things that Serverpod has to offer that we'll get into. But that, I think, is the real competitive advantage of this platform compared to using something like, Dart Shelf or Dart Frog, which are great in their own right. And they work with, not just Flutter, but the real power here is, hey, we're just going to make an end-to-end, type-safe system for talking to these things. I've worked a lot in building APIs, both in the back end and front end, and obviously the integration of them. And I always find so much of the work is that glue. It's that API layer that everything from the point that I have the data on the client and I need to transform it, send it to the server. The server needs to accept it, retransform it back, save it, send it back. And that whole thing is a lot of work. And Serverpod just does that for you. So I'm looking forward to getting into the actual architecture of this. We're going to be building this as a feature-based app following clean architecture. So we'll have repositories, we're going to have a domain layer, a data layer, a presentation layer, and we're going to be using solid principles too, which kind of go hand in hand with clean architecture, and I'll be pointing them out as we go. So thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.